So welcome everyone to our webinar today, Social Emotional Learning as a Tool to Build Positive Relationships and Improve School Connectedness, Prevent Bullying. My name is Jennifer Sanderlin, and I'm a Senior Education Partnerships Manager with Committee for Children. I'm going to serve as our host today and working in the chat box to answer questions and gather up any questions for our presenters at the end. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenters. Today we are so fortunate to have both of these really extremely smart and talented professionals in our field. Today we have Dr. Tia Kim, who is the Vice President of Education, Research, and Impact at Committee for Children. Tia leads our team of education designers and research scientists working to develop and elevate and evaluate the quality, the effectiveness, and the reach of our programs. She is a driving force for our organization's efforts to continually gather information about implementation fidelity, advance the evaluation process, focus on continuous improvement in learning, and to promote partnerships in the field. We are also very fortunate to have Dr. Dorothy Espelage. She is a psychologist and William C. Friday Distinguished Professor of Education at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's an international expert in bullying, youth aggression, and teen dating violence. She has authored several books, including Bullying in North American Schools, Bullying Prevention and Intervention, Realistic Strategies for Schools, and the Handbook of Bullying in Schools, an International Perspective. I am so fortunate to know both of these women very well and have presented together before. Would you like to both say hello before we dive in? Dr. Kim, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here with you all.
Hi, this is Dorothy. I'm excited to share some of our passion around SEL during October Bullying Prevention Month.
Wonderful. Thank you. And good reminder. We are leading into Bullying Prevention Month just as September is ending. Who can believe it? I certainly can't, how quickly September has gone by. But we're diving into our Bullying Prevention Month and some really great resources. So without further ado, I want to dive into our presentation so that you can get all of this wonderful information. But before we do that, I'm going to start with a video that really helps set the stage for why social emotional learning is critically important right now, why it is that we're presenting on this topic today, particularly in this sort of historic and unprecedented time. So here comes that video.
Challenging, unprecedented, uncertain. These words all describe what we're experiencing right now as students, educators, and families are faced with navigating a new normal. But as we plan for the school year ahead, one thing is clear: the intrinsic value of social emotional learning, or SEL. Here's why. 1. SEL can foster a sense of safety and be used with trauma-sensitive practices. Students can't focus on learning if they don't feel safe and supported. The COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis around systemic racism have created traumatic experiences for many families. These experiences contribute to fear, anger, and anxiety, and increase the risk of toxic stress. As part of a trauma-sensitive approach, SEL can help students manage their emotions in a safe and supportive way and set them up for learning success. 2. SEL helps build positive connections and relationships. This upcoming school year involves a lot of uncertainty, and site closures have made it difficult to maintain the strong relationships that previously developed between students, teachers, and families. This fall, whether you're planning for in-person or remote teaching, using SEL to build trusting connections within your learning community can help lay the necessary foundation for academic learning. 3. SEL helps address the learning inequality caused by school closures. Remote learning is inherently challenging and not always appropriate developmentally. Students who are already struggling socially or academically are often the ones who face more severe challenges with remote learning. SEL can play a key role in helping students build the skills they need for effective learning, from self-regulation to problem solving, especially in an out-of-school setting. 4. SEL provides support to teachers and staff. It's more important than ever to care for educators' well-being. By helping teachers and staff manage stress, build trust with students and colleagues, and stay engaged at work, SEL can strengthen the whole school community. Now is the time to bring SEL front and center. But don't just take our word for it. In a recent survey by CASEL with responses from 37 states, 84% reported that SEL has increased in importance as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And 78% of states reported that district-based SEL requests have increased since the beginning of the pandemic. We often talk about SEL in terms of improving behavior or its academic benefits. But SEL also builds skills that help bring us together in times of crisis and in everyday life. And in this uniquely challenging moment, SEL is a critical tool in both addressing the immediate needs of students, families, and staff, and helping them succeed in the new school year.
Okay, thank you for watching that. I hope it was helpful to kind of set the stage for where we're at and how SEL can really support some of the challenges that students and schools are facing right now. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and toss the baton to Dr. Espelage. Here it comes.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you to Committee for Children for being such a critical player during this stressful time for families and teachers and educators and just generally anybody that's trying to survive the day-to-day stresses that we have. And so I also am just impressed that we have 127 participants. Some of you are homeschooling your kids at the same time, doing your full-time job. So I appreciate this. So hopefully this is very helpful. In the work that I do with the National Academy of Education, we have spent quite a bit of time of trying to understand the increased risk of social-emotional challenges for kids and families. And we're finding, especially in countries where the pandemic kind of hit before the realization here in the States, and the data in the United States are starting to confirm, which much of you are living with on a daily basis, that there's heightened family stress. Some of us have lost family members, unfortunately, and represent that 200,000 deaths that we've just realized in the United States. So there's loss of family. Kids are feeling isolated from their peers and their friends through isolation. Unfortunately, as you've heard, many of DSS and Division of Family Services are reporting either fewer calls or the inability to address the growing rates of child abuse and neglect. And then just generally child traumatic stress with homeless rates, fear of evictions. This is all of what everyone is dealing with. And as Jennifer noted, CASEL surveys clearly showed that social-emotional learning and addressing these competencies and the ways in which we're living is one way in which we feel might give educators and families some control over the situation to be able to regulate some of these really, really heavy emotions. And so at the same time, we have a second kind of epidemic, if you will, in this country of the realizations of the race-related issues that have plagued our country for many, many years. So as we know, the killing of George Floyd and subsequent nationwide protests highlight the issues affecting our students of color and really have unmasked some inequities that were there that we weren't really paying attention to. Many students are aware of this crisis as they are out protesting, creating their own protesting movements. And so this intersectionality between the pandemic and race relations in the United States has created a perfect storm for hostility and really some deep, deep emotions that run deep in families and kids that are intergenerational and stem from a large history of institutional racism in this country. So we come to October. You believe it, October is going to be next week. Many of us have been hunkered down since March, trying to survive day to day. And what we're realizing that, and many of you that are educators are seeing that even the dynamics in the classroom seem to be spilling over into the remote access. It's more difficult to see, but teachers are certainly realizing that there's bullying that's happening, even if it's remote. Some of you are in hybrid situations. my nephew's in Florida, the state of Florida, where you can imagine what that is like, and he goes to school face-to-face every day, and very interesting dynamics. Once we do come out of this pandemic, bullying prevention will still be something that will have a cause for concern. And so we're going to try to focus in on what we know, what works around social emotional learning to reduce bullying prevention, bullying over time. So of the couple hundred articles, research articles that my team have published, there's consistent ongoing ways in which we think about effective bullying prevention. And certainly social emotional competencies is part of this Venn diagram. Social emotional competencies fit within this larger policies and procedures to expect certain types of behaviors in deterring others. We do know that the social emotional competencies that we instill in children and youth and adolescents really takes hold when we have the staff that understand the importance of these competencies. So there has to be ongoing staff training embedded within the policies and procedures. And when that happens, then we have an increased likelihood of reducing bullying in our schools. Policies and procedures still have a really good place here. You can imagine we're doing a lot of remote or hybrid, and there hasn't been a lot of discussion of what does bullying look like when you're in a Zoom classroom or other classroom settings. Hopefully we'll get out of this so that we can just move on to the policies and procedures set forth in our schools. But we do know that good policies, a good definition of bullying, consistent procedures of prevention as well as intervening when bullying does happen, heightened communication between teachers, educators, administrators, and families do contribute to the decrease in bullying across many of the states in the United States. But it's more than that. I think we're realizing in this very, very stressful time and in almost this existential crisis that many families and communities are under and going through, that we recognize that we have to think about the pro-social aspect and student well-being and the protective factors that we need to bolster within this time to reduce bullying. So it's not a matter of just reducing bullying, but it's a matter of addressing the risk factors, but then putting into place more protective factors. And that means trusting relationships and supportive schools and supportive online environments, and making sure that we take time to recognize that everybody's bringing different things to the table. So here I am, a university professor, and an example of social emotional competencies that we instill even with my graduate students and undergrads is for us to check in before every class to say, what is your rose, bud, or thorn? If anyone's interested in learning about that, just Google it. This idea of what are you excited about, what are you apprehensive about, and what is really, really troubling you. And so that really is grounded in social emotional competencies. And so you can take the rose, bud, thorn exercise and the appreciation that even undergrads or other faculty feel when you just ask, how are you doing? So when we think about bullying prevention and we have the policies and procedures in place, I wanted to just highlight, this is a middle school trial, efficacy trial, where we did a study with about 3,600 kids, 3-year study where middle school students received social emotional learning for 3 years, a total of like 42 lessons from empathy, perspective taking, emotion regulation, conflict management, all of those things that we are using in abundance these days. And in this trial, along with my colleagues Sabina Lowe, Josh, and Eric, we were able to rigorously evaluate the Second Step middle school program for outcomes such as bullying, peer victimization, but also sexual harassment and sexual violence, which is quite prevalent in middle school context. To summarize a 3-year trial, this was very complex and statistics heavy. Over that 3-year period, we found significant reductions in physical aggression, bullying, cyberbullying, homophobic name calling, and sexual harassment across the study. We did find for the teachers out there that are always challenged to think about implementation and how to fit this in, we did find greater reductions when teachers implemented the middle school program with fidelity as intended by the developers of Community for Children and engaged with the program as they would with academic curricula. So I think when we think about online, and what I think I've appreciated so much about Committee for Children and CASEL is how fast they pivoted to make sure that we had social emotional learning competencies ready there in March and April. And so my school partners in North Carolina benefited greatly from Committee for Children's pivoting and doing webinars such as these today to make sure that we keep our eye on this idea that academics are important, but without good social emotional competencies, we will not get the academic performance or the safety that we should see in kids. And this middle school trial showed very, very clearly that when it's implemented with fidelity, we have reductions of all forms of aggression. We have actually then tracked these kids, so it's totally 6 years later from sixth grade into high school, and found that the middle school program increased school belonging. And for some of you that work with middle school kids, even in this pandemic, there's still this angst with middle school, and we want them to feel connected as much as possible because we know that the lack of connection can lead to academic challenges. We found that the program itself heightened the school sense of belonging, and it led to reductions of all forms of harassment and bullying and homophobic name-calling into high school, 6-year study. This is just one example of many, many examples, including a meta-analysis by Durlak et al., including the meta-analysis more recently by Taylor, 2017. So if I say any of these publications you'd like, you certainly can find me at the University of North Carolina, and I can send these to you for your reference. We also were the only trial in this country, even to date, that has included students with disabilities and the extent to which social-emotional learning had an impact in reducing bullying perpetration. What we find here is a nice prevention effect. So those kids that were exposed to second step, their bullying went down a little bit. Those in the control condition went up, which is a normal trajectory, and that bullying would increase over the middle school years. So when you find your administrators or your school board saying, middle school is too late, that's absolutely not true. And when you do these evaluations, you must include students with disabilities, especially during this time when many of these students and their families are being more severely affected by access issues around remote instruction. But it's not about that we did this second step program last year. It's about embedding and integrating these programs permanently into a school community. It's also about really understanding and taking these programs, integrate them into it such that we foster recognition, improvement, adaptability, and continued motivation to use the program. So not the flavor of the month, but this becomes part of the fabric of the school. And in these times when we are coming to terms with the ways in which we have education inequities across race, ethnic, and sexual minority specific issues, we need to think about integrating more genuinely, more authentically, the discussions around race and equities in education. One way in which we've been able to do this now, we have been forever trying to not put all the burden of social-emotional learning instruction onto teachers when their plate is full. And what we have learned is that we have to think about social-emotional competencies by leveraging technology. I just wanted to show you a few examples. And this is a time in which we were still able to do some social-emotional learning transfer, if you will, during the pivot because of technology. And that's exactly what Committee for Children were able to do to reach their school partners in many, many ways. One idea that we're continuing to play with, because at this point, if we were able to use our virtual reality bullying prevention approach, we could have continued to do this in some districts. And so this is just an example where we partnered with some screenwriters to create 3 5-minute virtual reality scenarios that kids would go through with a curriculum that we built around it. And the results indicated in a small pilot an increase in empathy and a greater willingness to help bullying victims in those kids exposed to VR versus those that are exposed to just business as usual, that we don't bully around here. So there's something about immersion within the context of middle school students that was able to move the needle there. We also have developed what's called the Bully Down text messaging program, and this is where we developed this with middle school kids along with them. They came up with the title. They helped us write the text messaging programs. It aligns nicely with the social-emotional competencies, and this work we've been able to do during the pandemic. And so these are just some examples that I think many of us we've been talking about doing this work prior to the pandemic, but it's very, very clear that we need to be able to be flexible when we think about us moving forward when we may not have normalcy for another couple years. So I'm excited that you guys are here, that you're listening. I appreciate that you take this 1 hour of what is probably a very, very busy day to talk about social emotional learning. And I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Kim, to talk about strategies for promoting SEL remotely. Thank you.
Thanks. Before I move on, Dorothy, I had a question, hopefully, that you could answer related to what you just talked about.
Sure.
Is there one or two things that you think educators really need to keep in mind as they move forward with their bullying prevention efforts in this school year and perhaps next school year when, they're not operating, many of them, as business as normal or usual, like in traditional classrooms in physical buildings?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing and the biggest question that I get from, say, reporters and other academics is bullying still out there? And I think we have to recognize that kids are hyper stressed out and that it is still happening. And having that open conversation, a lot of teachers just don't want to bring it up. They have other things that they need to cover. But the reality is, if it's happening, then it's going to undermine their ability to be effective instructors. And so I think just having that conversation is very, very important. I think the other thing is, too, that, which we've often said in our earlier work, and I know, Tia, you've written about this before, that in order to have effective instruction, the kids need to be safe and feel as if there's a connection. So it might take away, you might not get through a particular lesson, but checking in with the kids and modeling the social emotional competencies, which must be challenging for many teachers that are having to teach remotely. And this is all new, but just owning it, I think, in some ways, Tia.
Great, thanks. I think that's a great segue to what I was going to talk about next, which is specifically thinking about what strategies we have to think about and put in place to promote social emotional learning remotely. And so I wanted to go over some of those with you. So I think everyone that's probably on this webinar recognizes that school is more than just a place where academic learning happens. For many kids, it's really a sanctuary where they can feel safe and really supported by a lot of great adults in their lives. And again, for many, many students, it's a great place to just have a sense of community where they can come together and play and hang out and talk with their friends. And obviously, for many students now, that really isn't the case. Many districts across the country have either gone to full remote learning to start off the school year or have gone into hybrid models where trying to create this kind of sanctuary and safe and supportive environment is a lot more difficult. But that doesn't mean that it's still not an important thing to do and to keep in mind, as Dorothy said, particularly around bullying prevention. And trying to rebuild the safe and supportive environment virtually or remotely takes some intentional thinking. And really, social emotional learning can really help to, again, create the safe space for within many classrooms and schools for students. So there are a couple of strategies I'd like to point out that I think are really important in starting this journey and really being intentional about how to promote social emotional learning, particularly, like as we said at the beginning of this webinar, it's something that's really important for a lot of our students these days as they deal with not only the pandemic, but other social contexts that are happening around them. And the first thing I'd like to always start off is really thinking about the adults or educators in schools. I like to use the analogy, if any of you have ever traveled on an airplane and they do their little safety rules, they always say, in case of an emergency, please put on your oxygen mask first before you help those around you. And I like using that analogy because I think the same can be said here in thinking about social emotional learning. And really that it's important for the adults that are supporting our students to prioritize their own well-being. And that means, it's a very stressful time for educators, but for them to do the things that can help with that stress and manage that stress, I think is important because then we can be better teachers, even better parents or caregivers for the students that we're trying to help and support. I think another important thing for prioritizing your own well-being is that we can then model appropriately, both implicitly and explicitly, the SEL skills that we're trying to promote in our students. So recently, I have 2 kids, and they're both in full remote learning. And just this week, my younger son, who's a 4th grader, he was having technological problems and he couldn't log in to his morning check-in. So I got really stressed out trying to help him because he was stressed out and I was stressed out, and then I was trying to get to a work meeting and it was running me late. And so I wasn't probably using my best social emotional skills to manage my frustration. And so I was kind of, verbalizing my frustration. And luckily my husband was around and he was like, it's not that big of a deal. Let's just calm down and let's kind of work through it. And it's okay if he misses it. We'll just talk to the teacher. So again, it's, I then realized in that moment that I had to manage my own stress to be a good sort of role model of expressing emotion management, SEL. So I think that's just a really great concrete example of why prioritizing our own well-being and our own stress levels can help in the support of social emotional skills for children and students. I'm going to touch on this a little bit more deeply later on, but Committee for Children has actually released a module or a unit in educator training that we're developing, and I'll go into that in a little bit more. And this is one of the main reasons why we decided to do that, because we do really understand the benefits of educator training and prioritizing educator well-being. The next important thing that I think schools should think about, and Dorothy touched on this as well, is that we really need to rebuild connections and community, and especially because that becomes a lot more difficult in virtual environments or remote environments. And some ways we can do that is, one, being able to provide structure through good rules and norms. I know listening to my middle schoolers classes, they talked the first full week of just, classroom norms and what that looks like when you're remote. So doing that, but also understanding that we have to be a little bit more flexible. I think Jen said that in the beginning about technology, being more flexible, because not all students have the same access to technology or the same access to support in the home to, for instance, get assignments done and that kind of thing. And I think it's really important to create really positive connections within students. And, I think teachers are very creative in being able to do that. I've already seen in a remote environment. And then just making intentional connection points. You can do this with checking in with your students, either individually or at the beginning of the day, and checking out with them. There's lots of different tools and resources available. I know just digitally. Recently, I saw this article. If any of you all are using Microsoft Teams as part of your learning platform, they have intentionally put in mechanisms to be able to do check-ins and polls and surveys to see and get emotional pulses on how students are doing. Second, Committee for Children has also, and I'll go into this more when I talk about our resources, has developed a rebuilding community unit that comes with some specific suggestions and also specific lessons that you all can do within your classrooms in this remote time to, again, intentionally build connections and create a great classroom community. So this is another really important point. And then lastly, I think it's really important that we create a coordinated system of supports. I think more than ever, families are important in being really engaged and involved in their students' education. And so how are schools and educators making those intentional connections, not only with their students, but also with their families? Because it's going to really take, the saying goes, a village to really help students learn in these times of crisis or during this time of the pandemic. Again, another great resource to help do this that Committee for Children has developed is our Imagine Neighborhood podcast, which I think is really great. It's primarily geared towards younger elementary school students, but it really goes over different SEL skills and it's intended for families to listen with their students together and have discussions around the different topics that are being brought up. So I encourage you, if you haven't, that's a great resource to send out to families. I think it's also, I always talk about this in terms of developing social emotional skills for students, that it's important for parents and caregivers to reinforce those skills at home, but I think even more so during these times. And so how can we figure out what resources we can send to parents so we're all talking about the same thing, particularly because for a lot of students, the home is also the classroom at this moment in time. And then, like I mentioned, we do have some resources that Committee for Children has created to help you all navigate during this upcoming school year, and for many of you to adapt, perhaps if you've been already using our programs, to use them either fully remotely or in a hybrid way. So I'd like to just go over those really quickly. First, I want to just highlight for you the website where you could find all these resources. You could see it there. It says secondstep.org /COVID-19 support. And all of these resources that I'm going to talk to you about are all listed there. So first, we've created some suggested second step implementation plans for both hybrid and remote learning. And what these implementation plans go over is we have a lot of different resources that you can utilize. And so we've created implementation plans that show you how you can combine all of these resources together to create just a holistic approach to SEL in this school year. We've also provided adaptation guides because like many of the curriculum that you probably use, both academic that are even academic, they're not intended to be used in a fully virtual remote setting. And so we've created adaptation guides to help you think through how you can do that with our programs. We've also put all our lesson scripts online, and so you don't need your physical cards to be able to teach the lesson. You can find them digitally. And like I mentioned earlier, we did create a second step community rebuilding unit, and that unit, again, like I said, is intentionally designed to help build connections with your classrooms and with your students. We've created an online professional learning for educators. I'll go into that in more detail next. And then we've also recorded our emotion management lessons for our second step elementary program. And so again, you can find that all listed here in this website. And then I just wanted to go over a little bit more detail for those of you that might be interested. Like I mentioned in our second step SEL for adults program, it's something we're developing. But first, we created this resiliency module. And you can find it there on the website that's listed right there. And what's really great about this is that it has adult-facing content and some student-facing content as well. We really designed this really quickly, actually. I was really proud of the team that created this because it was really in response to what we knew that all educators would be having to deal with as they went into this new school year. And there were 3 main units for educators in this resiliency module. The first one is self-care. The second one is how to care for one another. And the third is how to help with student care or support student care. And again, we felt like these topics were really important to help set up educators to be able to be, as supportive as possible for the students coming in to this school year. And there is some student-facing content that is related to similar topic areas, so some lessons that educators could use as well. And this is really free to the public and designed for anyone to use. And we really wanted to put it out there to help support staff, but also because we wanted to be able to get feedback from it for anyone who decided to use it and to use this feedback to, of course, make the program even better or make improvements to it or think about what new modules we might want to add to it. So definitely check it out if you think that would be helpful to all of you. And I think that's it. So I'll just turn it back over to Jen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I know it always feels so fast and furious when we pack in a lot of information. So I'm just looking at the chat box, but I I do know that one question that's come up quite a bit is around online bullying and things that people can be looking for or strategies they might be thinking about in terms of which SEL skills might help in that, thinking about online bullying. I know we're sort of getting away from cyberbullying, I think, because basically bullying can happen anywhere and online is just as prevalent as in person, maybe even more so. So I just wonder if either of you could talk about online bullying and strategies or things that might be of importance there.
Yeah, so I'll take that, Tan, then if you want to add. So it's at this point, we don't have good data. Most of it is anecdotal around what teachers are experiencing, some of the disrespectful behavior that peers may have towards one another, but we don't have good data. Now, what we do know is prior to the pandemic that the face-to-face bullying was much more prevalent in this country than online. Again, we don't know what the data is going to look like if they shift. We're kind of waiting for researchers that were able to get what we call IRB approval to do some studies. And then we'll have to look at the national data when kids report. What we are finding, so we've just finished conducting the largest meta-analysis of cyberbullying outcomes, so interventions that target both bullying and cyberbullying. And what we found is that most of the classroom curriculum that we evaluated were equally effective in reducing face-to-face bullying as they were reducing cyberbullying. And so it seems as if there's overlapping risk and protective factors. And so what we find, the components of social-emotional learning or bullying prevention programs that are the most effective involve teacher training, involve working with the kids to develop these social-emotional competencies, the use of multimedia. But there's no definitive answer of does it look any different now that they're online. I think the jury's kind of out on that. But T, I don't know if you guys at Committee for Children have seen any other indication to that effect.
No, I think what you said is right on.
But stay tuned. I mean, I think it's very interesting, too. Our meta-analysis showed that you don't necessarily have to talk about cyberbullying to impact cyberbullying, that if we're creating safe spaces in classrooms and giving kids the ability to manage peer conflicts in successful ways, we equally reduce face-to-face or online bullying, largely because the online bullying is not anonymous. As much as the media wants you to think that this is a stranger going after you online, most of the victims of cyberbullying have been victimized by the same students in school. But we'll have to see how that plays out as we go forward.
Yeah, and I think that's right, that a lot of it crosses platforms. I don't know if platforms is the right word, right? Like what happens like in person and then it goes back to online and back and forth. It's just a different circumstance now because they don't actually physically see each other anymore. But yeah.
Right. And I'm on the advisory board of TikTok, and I advise them on how do you detect bullying within TikTok videos. And families, there's very positive things about making TikTok videos with families, and but there also is that mean and cruel behavior that people engage in, whether it's on Twitter or YouTube, seems to be spilling over until, one of the largest apps that's happening now, and that's TikTok. So it seems like there's something systemic in many of our societies that when we see something that we seem to attack differences. But again, this is unknown, right? I've been studying bullying since 1995, and people look to me as if I know, we haven't had a pandemic in 100 years, and I've never studied bullying within the context of pandemic, and I'm not going to pretend to have the answers here. I think there's just lots of unknowns, but I think what I'd love to do is we're just collecting in my lab teachers' report of what they're seeing in their Zoom classrooms and how kids that are stressed out may be taking it out on their peers just as they would within a classroom setting.
That's a very good point, especially I think there was a follow-up question here just in the chat box asking if you do have any recommendations, ways to actually have kids interact with each other, that this person's struggling to recommend anything because of the online bullying. So it's like this hesitancy to have kids interact with each other unless we can fully supervise them online. I can see how that would be a big struggle. I don't know if you've heard of any kind of platforms or solutions that If you haven't, it's okay. I just thought in case you have, that are good ways for kids to actually interact that can provide a little more safety, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah, Jennifer, I mean, that's a great question, right? So, we have tech companies that are coming up in very interesting ways. So as a university professor, I can break out my students into breakout rooms as if they were going to do some role plays or have breakout discussions. But in the K through 12 context, I would be leery of that if you're not going to have an adult within that breakout room. We've known for years, online courses like MOOCs, that there's bullying that happens in there, and that for some of the teachers that are on that have used any kind of peer review, like passing around people's, stories that they write to other peers, they can be mean and cruel. So I would caution against using some of these technologies that Zoom and other people have developed, but they haven't really thought about the sensitivity issues within K through 12 settings. Because we're even have challenges at the university of putting students into breakout rooms, but yet we don't. And then they come back and say, well, I felt uncomfortable in this breakout room, especially if it's sensitive information. So I would be cautious, honestly. Yeah.
I would agree with that. And I think I wanted to reiterate a point that I said earlier, is that I think it's really, really important to create really strong norms and rules. I think sometimes students think, oh, I'm at my house and I'm just on a computer, that it's not really school and I don't have to follow the same rules, but you do. And that goes the same thing. It's not tolerated if you're making inappropriate comments in a classroom. It's not tolerated if you do that on screen too. So, and always just going back to those rules and reiterating those, I think is really important.
I love that, Tia, to think about, that classroom, that virtual classroom, you still have to attend to the climate. I love it. Yeah.
Great. Well, there was a follow-up comment saying another reason to tie SEL into our behavior expectation PBIS framework. So yes, exactly. For our program for Second Step, we definitely have that in mind and have a, alignment document you can refer to if you want some language. I guess speaking of that, just one last thing for you, Tia, would be to just thinking about if you're teaching. I've gotten a few comments that people are excited to be teaching the bullying prevention programs that we have. I was wondered if you might give a little advice on teaching the lessons themselves. I know we've been really saying focus on the training. So if there's anything you can offer there, that'd be helpful to folks. Yeah,
so definitely focus on the training. Like I said, it's really important for educators to be able to support students adequately. And we also actually are working on currently kind of adaptation guides for our bullying prevention unit. So I know again, the lessons aren't totally set up to be able to do remotely. And so look out for that. That should be coming out very, very soon here. And we give suggestions on how to do that, and particular lessons to focus on. Some of the scenarios, again, might not totally be appropriate because they're about in classroom or in school scenarios, but we provide some suggestions on how you might want to do that. And we also call out some other programs that are free to, help supplement or align to or use in support of our bullying prevention unit. So definitely look out for that.
Great. That is going to be very helpful. I think, there's a caution, as much as we were talking about having, kids in breakout rooms. There's also been a sort of a caution of thinking about what if the home situation, this just came in the chat box, that, the challenge is that when household culture is okay with giving off bully-like behavior, that's, obviously that's a really big challenge. They're spending a lot more time in the home, and that's one of the sort of really big kind of questions about how do we teach this while they're in that setting. So I'm glad that we'll have some guidance to offer.
Yeah, and I think one thing we suggest is that, and this is really difficult because, not every school has resources to be able to do that. But for instance, if you are going to be implementing the bullying prevention unit or the lessons, is if possible to have another adult in the room to just kind of look out for signs of stress or, when different lessons are coming out. So that if that's possible, I think that's a great way to help support kids as well.
That's great. Good idea. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions coming through. I want to just make sure to say thank you to both of you for taking the time today. This was really helpful information. I want to remind everybody too that you'll get a copy of this PowerPoint presentation in your follow-up. So if you'd like to share that out or refer back, we hope that you will. I hope this has been helpful. I know it's always really enlightening to me when I get to hear from both of these really amazing professionals in our field. And so I appreciate taking the time. I really appreciate all of you and the work you're doing. We certainly at Committee for Children, we could not do the work we do without the folks that are actually delivering our programs, helping us to create better programs and features. And so we're just thankful that you are doing that really hard work that helps us with our mission. So would you two like to say goodbye before we head out?
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you for all your hard work.
Absolutely.
Yes, wonderful. Lots of thank yous coming in the chat box to you both. So everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope that we'll see you on another webinar here soon. Just go back to the same place that you registered for this one. We'll have a whole new schedule of webinars coming up for October. And don't forget to take a look at our bullying prevention resources for Bullying Prevention Month coming up. All right, thanks everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye.